Hello students, in this session we are going to know about pollination. So what is pollination? Transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma is called pollination. So pollination means transfer of pollen grains. So pollination means transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. So this is the stigma, which is the receptive part, and this is the anther. So anther release the pollen grains. So these are the pollen grains and they transfer to stigma. So the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma is called pollination. So pollination is generally two types. So pollination generally it is two types. One is self-pollination and another one is cross-pollination. So let us understand what is self-pollination. So if the pollen grains from the anther of the same plant falls on the stigma of the same plant, that is known as self-pollination. So here, so this is the flower and this is the stigma of the flower and this is anther. So if the pollen grains of the same plant, okay, they fall on the same stigma, this kind of transfer is called self-pollination. If the pollination occurs between the two flowers of the same plant, for example, this is another flower of the plant, okay. So if the pollen grains from this flower falls on this flower, okay, this kind of the self-pollination is known as geitonogamy. If the pollen grains from same flower falls on the same stigma, then it is known as autogamy. So this is autogamy and this kind of transfer is geitonogamy. So what is self-pollination? Transfer of pollen grains from anther of the same plant to stigma of the same plant, that is self-pollination. Within the self-pollination we can see autogamy. Autogamy means it occurs within the same flower. The anthers from same flower falls on the stigma of the same flower, then it is known as autogamy. If the pollen grains from one flower falls on the stigma of the another flower of the same plant, then it is known as geitonogamy. Now let us talk about the cross-pollination. So cross-pollination, it occurs between two different plants. So for example, this is one plant and this is another plant. So this is the flower and this is another flower. So these two are different plants, right? So this is the stigma and this is the anther. So if the pollen grains from one plant falls on the stigma of the other plant, if the pollen grains from one plant falls on the stigma of the another plant, this kind of pollination is called cross-pollination. For the cross-pollination, we need pollinating agents. For cross-pollination to occur, so we need pollinating agents. Okay, generally these pollinating agents are two kinds. pollinating agents are two kinds. One is abiotic. Abiotic in the sense non-living. So non-living pollinating agents are water and wind, and this is also known as hydrophily. Hydrophily. So the pollen grains are transferred through water. If pollen grains transfer through air, then this kind of pollination is called wind pollination. So this is also known as anemophily. These two are the abiotic factors or abiotic pollinators. So abiotic pollinators in the sense they are non-living objects. Right. Now let us understand biotic factors. So biotic pollinators are biotic factors. So biotic in the sense they are living. So biotic factors includes insects, birds, some other animals. These animals, mainly insects, they are attracted by the nectar given by the flower. So they fall on the flower, and this pollen grains, which are yellowish in color, they stick to their body, and when they reach to the female flower, when insect land on the female flower, then the pollen grains which are stick to the body of the insect fall on the stigma. So when pollen grain falls on the stigma, then it leads to formation of the pollen tube. So when right pollen grain falls on the right stigma, then the pollen germination and pollen tube growth occurs. So let us summarize the pollination process. So pollination means transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma. So pollination generally two kinds. One is self-pollination. So self-pollination means transfer of pollen grain from anther of the same flower to stigma of the same flower. Generally, if transfer occur within the same flower of the same plant, then it is autogamy. If it occurs between the two different flowers of the same plant, then it is known as geitonogamy. So comes to the cross pollination. Cross pollination occurs between different plants, not on the same plant. So the pollen grains from one plant reach to the another plant. So this kind is known as cross pollination, and cross pollination is also known as xenogamy. Cross pollination is also known as xenogamy. It requires agents, generally abiotic agents, water and wind. Biotic agents, mostly insects. Some birds, bats and others also can transfer the pollen grains. So insects get the nectar, sweetness and attracting colors, smell, so that they can land on the flowers and they can transfer the pollen grains from one flower to another flower. So this is all about the pollination. Hello students, in our previous session we have seen how pollination occurs in flowering plants. Generally pollination is self-pollination and cross-pollination. Either the way the pollen grains reach to the stigma of the female part. Now in this class we are going to understand fertilization and formation of seeds and fruits. So fertilization, formation of seeds and fruits. So when the right pollen grain, when the right type of the pollen grain falls on the right type of the stigma, when the right type of the pollen grain falls on the right type of the stigma, the pollen germination occurs. So this is the pollen grain which fall on the stigma. So when right type of pollen grain fall on the right type of the stigma, pollen germination occur. So from pollen grain there is a growth of tube-like structure. So this tube-like structure enters into style. Through the style it goes into ovary, and through the ovary it goes inside the ovule. It goes inside the ovule, and inside the ovule there is a embryo sac. Inside the ovule there is embryo sac, and this embryo sac contain egg. So this is the egg. So when right pollen grain fall on the right stigma, pollen germination occur and it will form the pollen tube. So this pollen tube grows through the stigma, style, ovary, enters into ovule and reach up to embryo sac. At the embryo sac, this pollen tube release two male gametes. At the embryo sac, this pollen grain release two male gametes. Okay, so one male gamete fuse with egg and form the zygote. One male gamete plus egg. So fusion of male gamete with egg, that would result in the formation of diploid zygote. Diploid zygote. We know gametes are haploid. So these haploid gametes fuse and form the diploid zygote. So this fusion is called syngamy or fertilization. Syngamy. That would result in the formation of the diploid zygote. And another male gamete fuse with the secondary diploid nucleus that is present inside the embryo sac. Secondary nucleus, and forms primary endospermic nucleus. Primary endospermic nucleus. So one male, this pollen tube release two male gametes. One male gamete fuse with the egg and form the zygote. So this fusion is known as syngamy, and that would result in the formation of zygote. And another male gamete fuse with secondary nucleus and form primary endospermic nucleus. This primary endospermic nucleus provide the nutrition to growing embryo. So this zygote after formation undergo several mitotic divisions, and it will form the embryo. So the outer covering of this embryo, that is ovule. So ovule after fertilization develops into seed. So zygote will be converted into embryo. So ovule will be converted into seed, and ovary will be converted into fruit. The remaining parts of the flower like calyx, corolla, stigma, style, anthers, filaments all diminishes, and only the zygote converted into embryo. So this is the embryo, and the ovule converted into seed enclosing the embryo. So this is the seed which enclose the embryo, and the ovary converted into fruit. Okay, so this is how flowering plants can produce the seeds and fruits. So fertilization means what? Fusion of gametes. So how does fusion of gametes occur? So when pollen grain fall on the stigma, there is a germination of pollen grain and formation of the pollen tube. This pollen tube grows through stigma, style, ovary and into the ovule. So inside the ovule there is embryo sac present. Inside the embryo sac there is a female gamete. So this pollen tube release two male gametes. Pollen tube release two male gametes. So one male gamete fuse with the egg and form the zygote, and another male gamete fuse with the secondary nucleus and form primary endospermic nucleus. So this zygote, by utilizing the nutrition from primary endospermic nucleus, undergo several mitotic divisions and form the embryo. Now this embryo is enclosed by seed. So usually ovule get converted into seed and ovary get converted into fruit, and remaining parts of the flower fall off.